My father slammed the paper down so hard the silverware rattled against the plates. No one spoke. Not my mother. Not my sister. Not even me. The paper slid across the table until it stopped inches from my hand, the corner brushing against my wrist like it had been aimed there. I stared at it without touching it, my stomach tightening before I even read a single word. Pay $20,000. My father said, his voice flat and cold. Or get out. The words hung in the air like smoke. My mother didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on her plate, cutting her chicken into neat pieces she didn't eat. And if you delay, she added quietly, the fees will grow. My sister let out a soft laugh under her breath. Not loud enough to be called cruel, just loud enough to make sure I heard it. You've lived off us long enough, she said. I still hadn't picked up the paper. My father leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping against the table in sharp, impatient beats. You have until Sunday night, he said. Not a minute later. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. I finally lowered my eyes to the paper. A spreadsheet. Clean. Organized. Detailed. Every line item listed with precision. Rent. Utilities. Groceries. Maintenance costs. Even shared household supplies were broken down into neat columns, each with dates beside them. Some of those dates went back years. Years. My chest tightened as I scanned the numbers. They hadn't just made this overnight. They had been building this, tracking me, recording everything, or at least rewriting it. Where did this come from? I asked quietly. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. My father didn't hesitate. You've lived here long enough to owe us, he said. My mother nodded once, still not looking at me. My sister leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching me like she was waiting for a show. I traced one line with my finger. Heating repair. 3 winters ago. My throat tightened as the memory rushed back without permission. That winter, the furnace had died in the middle of the night. The house had been freezing, and my father had panicked because the repair company demanded payment up front. I had covered the bill myself without hesitation. He had thanked me back then, called me responsible, said he was proud. Now that same repair was listed here as something I owed them. I swallowed slowly. This wasn't just accounting. This was erasing history. This includes expenses we covered for you, my father continued, his tone steady. Rehearsed? Rehearsed. That word settled heavily in my mind. I glanced up and noticed something I hadn't seen before. A second printed copy of the spreadsheet rested beside my mother's plate. She didn't move it, didn't acknowledge it. But it was there, prepared. Ready? They hadn't just discussed this. They had practiced it. You thought living here was free, my sister said, tilting her head slightly. Her voice carried that familiar edge, the same one she used when we were children, and she knew she had the upper hand. You're almost 60, my mother added, finally lifting her eyes to meet mine. It's time you acted like an adult. Something inside me shifted at that moment. Not anger. Recognition. This wasn't about money. This was about control. My father tapped the paper again. Harder this time. You have until Sunday, he repeated. His voice carried a sharper edge now. If you don't pay, my mother said calmly, we'll add late fees daily. My sister smirked. Better start packing, she murmured. I forced myself to keep reading the spreadsheet. Line after line blurred together until one number caught my attention, a charge I knew with absolute certainty I had never owed. Not once. Not ever. That was when the cold realization settled in. This list wasn't just unfair.
It was wrong.
Deliberately wrong. My father stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a harsh scrape against the floor. You've taken enough from this family, he said. Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. My mother gathered her fork and knife neatly on her plate, her expression calm, almost satisfied. My sister rolled her eyes, like the entire moment bored her. I didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't defend myself. Instead, I folded the paper slowly and placed it in front of me, because reacting emotionally would only give them what they wanted. And deep down, something told me this wasn't finished. Not even close. Dinner ended without another word. No one asked if I had eaten. No one looked at me as I stood from the table and carried the folded paper upstairs. Each step felt heavier than the last. The hallway felt colder than it ever had before. The house that once held laughter and long Sunday mornings suddenly felt unfamiliar, like a place I was visiting. Not living inside my bedroom. I closed the door softly behind me. The quiet inside that room felt different. Safer. But tense. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the paper again. $20,000. Sunday night. Or leave. I let out a slow breath. Then my eyes drifted toward the closet. Toward the back shelf. Toward something I hadn't touched in years. I slid off the bed and knelt on the floor, pushing aside a stack of old boxes until my fingers found the edge of a small metal container hidden against the wall. It was scratched along the sides. Dull from age. Heavier than it looked. I pulled it into the light. For a moment, I just stared at it. My mother had given this to me years ago. Told me to keep it safe. Told me it might matter someday, even if I didn't understand why. Back then, I thought it was sentimental. Now it felt strategic. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside were several sealed envelopes, neatly stacked, legal-looking papers, and one folded sheet with my mother's handwriting on the front. My heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from something sharper, something colder. I picked up the first envelope and held it between my fingers. Because suddenly, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. That dinner downstairs was never just about $20,000. I sat on the edge of my bed long after the house went quiet, the metal box resting heavily in my lap. The folded spreadsheet still lay beside me, the number $20,000 staring back like it had burned itself into the page. I kept looking at it, not because I believed it, but because I was trying to understand the intention behind it. They hadn't just asked for money. They had prepared for this. Every column, every charge, every calculated fee told me the same thing. This was planned long before tonight, and the strangest part was not the number. It was the certainty in their voices. None of them had asked how I would pay. They only demanded that I do. That realization settled into my chest like a stone. This wasn't about fairness. This was about forcing me out. Slowly, I reached down and lifted the lid of the metal box again. The hinges creaked softly, the sound loud in the stillness of the room. The house around me felt unnaturally quiet, like it was holding its breath along with me. Inside the box, the envelopes lay exactly where I remembered them, yellowed slightly at the edges, sealed carefully, each one labeled with dates written in my mother's neat handwriting. Not recent dates, old ones, years old. My fingers hovered over the top envelope before finally lifting it. I remembered the day my mother handed me this box. I had been standing in the kitchen, confused, wiping flour from my hands after helping her bake bread. "Keep this safe," she had told me. I had laughed back then. "What is it?" I asked. "Something you may need one day," she said. Her voice had been calm, but serious in a way I didn't understand at the time. Now, sitting alone in my bedroom with the house heavy around me, that memory felt different. Strategic, not sentimental. I slid one envelope free and turned it over. The paper inside felt thicker than ordinary letters, the weight of it unfamiliar. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases with my palm. The first thing I noticed was my mother's handwriting. Tight. Controlled. Familiar. Linda, if you are reading this, it means something has changed in the house. Something that made you reach for this box. I paused there, my chest tightening. She had written this as if she knew, as if she expected tonight to happen. I kept reading. I have always believed you were the only one who paid attention to the details, the only one who noticed when things didn't add up. Your father is a good man, but he trusts too easily, too quickly. The words made my throat tighten. I could almost hear her voice as I read them. Soft, Measured. Never dramatic. There was no anger in her message. No blame. Only warning. If the business ever begins to struggle, or if pressure begins to build, you must not ignore the signs. Sometimes protection comes from preparation, not confrontation. I lowered the paper slightly and stared at the wall. Protection. Preparation. Those words echoed in my mind. I kept reading. At the bottom of the letter, beneath her signature, was a name written clearly. Daniel Reeves. Underlined. Twice. I stared at the name longer than I expected to. Daniel Reeves. I knew that name. He had been around when I was younger, a quiet man who visited the house occasionally with files and briefcases. He spoke mostly to my mother, rarely to anyone else. Why would she underline his name twice? Slowly, I reached for another document inside the box. This one was thicker, formal, folded carefully into precise sections. I unfolded it and felt a sudden chill run through my hands. Legal formatting. Typed paragraphs. Official seals. And then, my name, printed clearly across the top of the page. Linda Harper. I blinked, reading the line again to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My name appeared again further down the page. And again, and again. A strange tightness spread through my chest. I didn't remember signing anything like this. Not consciously. Not knowingly. But the signatures at the bottom, they looked like mine. My hand moved slowly across the page, tracing the lines without touching them fully. Certain phrases stood out immediately. Authorized representative. Controlling authority. Operational consent required. The words didn't make full sense yet, but they carried weight. Legal weight. I placed the ultimatum paper from dinner beside the document, staring at the contrast between them. One page filled with accusations, the other filled with authority. That difference made my stomach twist. Why now? Why demand money tonight of all nights? My mind drifted back to earlier in the week, to a moment I hadn't thought much about at the time. I had been passing through the hallway when I heard my sister's voice in the kitchen, low and sharp. "She won't know until it's too late," she had whispered. At the time, I assumed she was talking about something else. Now, that memory landed differently, heavier, more dangerous. I leaned back slightly against the bed frame, staring at the lawyer's name again. Daniel Reeves. My fingers hovered over my phone. Should I call? The clock on the nightstand read just past 9. Not too late. Not early enough to feel comfortable. But waiting suddenly felt more dangerous than acting. I exhaled slowly and picked up the phone. The number printed on the document was still readable. Clear. Deliberate. Like my mother expected it to be used. I dialed. Each tone echoed loudly in my ear. Once. Twice. 3 times. I expected voicemail. Instead, the line clicked. Daniel Reeves speaking? The calmness in his voice made my heart skip. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I swallowed and forced the words out. "My name is Linda Harper," I said quietly. "My mother, Margaret Harper, gave me your number years ago." Silence followed. Not empty silence. Recognizing silence. Then his tone shifted. "Linda," he said slowly, "I've been wondering when you would call." The words sent a cold ripple down my spine. He had been expecting this. Waiting for this. "I found documents," I said carefully. "I don't fully understand them. I suspected that might happen someday," he replied. My grip tightened around the phone. "Can you explain them to me?" I asked. A pause followed. Measured. Deliberate. "Not over the phone," he said. That answer landed heavier than I expected. "Come see me tomorrow morning," he added. "Bring everything your mother left you." Tomorrow morning? Urgency without panic. Preparation without chaos. "All right," I said. We ended the call. The room felt quieter than before, but not calmer. Something had shifted. Something irreversible. I placed the documents back into the metal box, stacking them carefully. Just as I lowered the lid, a sound drifted faintly from downstairs. Voices. Low. Tense. I moved toward the bedroom door slowly and cracked it open just enough to listen. My father's voice carried through the hallway. "We need the money soon," he muttered. My sister's voice followed. "She'll leave," she said. "She always backs down." That sentence stayed with me long after their voices faded. Always backs down. I closed the door quietly and leaned against it. They believed they understood me. They believed I would panic. They believed I would beg. Slowly, I turned back toward the bed and opened the metal box one last time. I took out the documents again and placed them neatly on the desk. Then I reached for a notepad and began writing. Meet lawyer. Secure documents. Prepare to leave if necessary. Each word felt heavier than the last, but clearer. For the first time since dinner, fear began to fade. Not completely, but enough to leave space for something else. Clarity. Because if my mother planned this years ago, then tonight wasn't the beginning of my crisis. It was the beginning of theirs. The kitchen felt colder than usual the next morning, even though the coffee maker hissed and steamed like it always did. I walked in quietly, the legal folder tucked inside my bag, and immediately noticed the spreadsheet still lying in the middle of the table. My father had added handwritten notes along the margins overnight. Numbers circled. Amounts underlined. New figures squeezed into spaces that hadn't existed before. They were still calculating. Still tightening the noose. My mother sat at the table with her coffee untouched, staring at the same spot on the wall like she was rehearsing something in her mind. My sister scrolled through her phone, tapping the screen harder than necessary. My father pretended to read the newspaper. Pretended, because he hadn't turned the page once. I poured myself coffee without speaking. The smell should have been comforting. Instead, it felt sharp, almost bitter in my throat. No one greeted me. No one asked where I had been the night before. Silence stretched until it felt like pressure against my chest. Then my father lowered the newspaper slightly and spoke without looking at me. "Did you make progress on the money?" There it was again. Not concern. Not curiosity. Demand. I lifted my coffee cup and took a slow sip, buying myself a few seconds of calm. "I have an appointment today," I said. That made him look up. "With who?" he asked immediately. The speed of the question told me everything I needed to know. Suspicion. Control. Fear hiding underneath. "A lawyer," I answered. The word landed heavily between us. My mother froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of her mug. My sister stopped tapping her phone. Even my father lowered the newspaper completely now, his eyes fixed on me in a way that felt sharper than anger. "Why would you need a lawyer?" he asked. His voice sounded different, less confident, more strained. I didn't answer. Instead, I placed my coffee cup down gently, turned toward the hallway, and picked up my keys from the counter. For the first time since that dinner, I saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty. I walked out without another word. Outside, the morning air felt colder than it should have been. I slid into my car, set the legal folder carefully on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment before turning the key. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady but tense. If they thought yesterday was pressure, today was about clarity. The law office sat on a quiet street downtown, the kind of building people passed without noticing. Neutral brick, small sign, nothing dramatic about it. But the moment I stepped inside, everything felt different. Quiet. Ordered. Professional. The smell of paper and polished wood filled the air. A receptionist looked up as soon as I entered. "Ms. Harper," she asked. I nodded. She smiled gently. "Mr. Reeves is expecting you." Expecting me. That word settled heavily in my chest. This meeting hadn't been arranged overnight. It had been waiting. For years. I followed her down a narrow hallway lined with framed certificates and closed office doors. Each step echoed softly against the floor. She stopped at a door and knocked once. "Come in," a calm voice answered. Inside sat Daniel Reeves. Older than I remembered, his hair now completely gray, but his posture still straight, his expression steady. A stack of files rested neatly on the desk in front of him. He stood as I entered. "Linda," he said gently. "It's been a long time." His voice carried recognition, not surprise. "I'm sorry it took this long," I replied quietly. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit," he said. "Let's take a look at what your mother left you." I placed the folder on the desk and opened it slowly. But before I could slide my documents toward him, he reached to the side and pulled out another stack of papers. Identical. Organized. Filed neatly. My breath caught in my throat. "You kept copies," I said. He nodded once. "Your mother insisted," he replied. That confirmation made my chest tighten. Nothing about this had been accidental. He opened the top document and turned it toward me. "Your mother transferred controlling authority shares of the family business into your name," he said calmly. The words didn't hit all at once. They sank slowly. He continued. "Not full ownership," he clarified, "but operational authority. Without your consent, certain business functions cannot legally proceed." I stared at the document again. My name, printed clearly across the top, repeated through the legal paragraphs, repeated where signatures belonged. "That means," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "They need you," he finished. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Real. Did my father know about this? I asked. Mr. Reeves watched me carefully before answering. "Your mother chose not to tell him," he said. That answer landed like a weight in my chest. Not tell him. Not trust him. He reached for another file and opened it. "This is more recent," he said. Inside were printed statements, invoices, overdue notices, highlighted balances. My stomach tightened as I scanned the numbers. Unpaid vendor accounts, missed filings, late fees stacking higher with each entry. "Your family business is under financial pressure," he said calmly. "More than they're likely admitting." One number stood out among the rest, far larger than the $20,000 they demanded from me. I leaned back slightly in the chair, trying to steady my breathing. "This wasn't about rent," I murmured. "No," he agreed quietly. "It was about survival." He flipped another page. "These withdrawals?" he said, pointing to a series of transactions. "They're unusual." I leaned forward, scanning the dates. Patterns formed quickly. The timeline matched exactly with the period when my sister began helping with bookkeeping. My throat tightened. "Has your sister been involved in the accounts?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. His silence confirmed my fear. "Without your authorization," he continued, "several vendor contracts cannot be renewed." He met my eyes. "And if you withdraw completely, operations may freeze." That word stayed with me. Freeze. Everything stopping. Everything collapsing. "If I leave?" I asked slowly. "What happens to them?" He didn't hesitate. "They may lose everything." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. He leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting from explanation to warning. "Do not sign anything they place in front of you," he said firmly. "Not until you fully understand what's happening." I nodded slowly. Every word felt like a piece of armor settling into place. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my car in silence. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. For years, I believed I was just helping, just filling in gaps, just keeping things running. Now I understood something deeper. I hadn't just been helping. I had been protecting something, and they never even realized it. My phone buzzed suddenly in my hand. A message from my sister. "Don't forget Sunday. Dad isn't joking." I stared at the words for a long moment. They still believed they controlled the timeline. They still believed I was trapped by their deadline. But sitting there in that quiet car, one thing became clear. The real question wasn't whether I would pay. It was whether they would survive without me. I stayed in the car longer than necessary when I returned home that afternoon, watching the front porch like it might reveal something if I stared hard enough. The porch light was already on. It wasn't even dark yet. That small detail tightened something deep inside my chest. Someone had turned it on early, not out of habit. But anticipation, they were waiting. The legal folder sat on the passenger seat beside me, silent but heavy with meaning. I rested my hand on top of it for a moment, steadying myself before stepping out of the car. When I walked inside, the smell of dinner filled the house. Familiar, but no longer comforting. They were already seated at the table, just like the night before. Same positions, same silence. My father didn't greet me. He simply nodded toward my chair as if I were late to something important. I sat down without speaking. "Did you make progress on the money?" he asked. Not hello. Not how was your day. Straight to the demand. "I'm working on it," I replied carefully. My mother placed her fork down and looked at me for the first time since I entered. "You should start selling things if you have to," she said. "Jewelry. Furniture. Whatever it takes." My sister let out a short laugh. "Maybe pawn your necklace," she added. "That one you never take off?" Her tone wasn't playful. It was sharp. Deliberate. Every word felt like pressure pressing down on my shoulders. I kept my face calm. Inside, something colder was forming. My father checked his watch, not casually, but repeatedly. His fingers tapped against the table in short, restless movements. He was waiting. For something, then the phone rang. Sharp. Loud. Too loud in the quiet room. He grabbed it quickly. "Yes?" he answered. His voice shifted instantly. Serious. Tense. I couldn't hear the person on the other end, but I watched his expression carefully. His jaw tightened. His shoulders stiffened. "Yes, we'll take care of it," he said. Pause. "No. Not yet." His hand trembled slightly before he hung up. That small movement stayed with me. My mother leaned toward him. "What did they say?" she asked. He shook his head quickly. "Nothing we can't fix," he muttered. But his voice didn't sound confident. It sounded afraid. That was when I knew. They were in trouble. Real trouble. My father turned back toward me, his face harder now. "You now have until tomorrow night," he said. The words landed heavily. "Tomorrow?" I asked before I could stop myself. The deadline had changed. Shortened. My mother folded her hands neatly in front of her. "We won't wait any longer," she said calmly. My sister smirked. "You'd better start packing," she added. I nodded once, pretending to accept the change. But inside, everything sharpened. They were rushing, which meant something was getting worse. Later that evening, the house grew quiet again. Doors closed. Lights dimmed. I walked slowly down the hallway, passing my father's office. The door stood slightly open, just enough to catch my attention. That alone was unusual. He never left that door open. Curiosity pulled me closer. I leaned slightly, glancing inside. The desk was covered with papers. Not organized. Not neat. Messy. Desperate. Several envelopes lay stacked in uneven piles. Bright red stamps screamed across the top of them. Past due. Immediate action required. Final notice. My stomach tightened as I stared at those words. This wasn't about rent. This wasn't about fairness. This was about survival. They needed money, not because I owed them, but because something bigger was collapsing. I stepped away quietly and returned to my room before anyone noticed. Not long after, my father called everyone back into the living room. We gathered like strangers, standing around furniture that once held laughter and family movies. "You've taken advantage long enough," he said, staring directly at me. His voice carried frustration, but beneath it, I heard fear. My mother nodded slowly beside him. My sister crossed her arms. "You're lucky we didn't kick you out sooner," she added. That sentence cut deeper than I expected. Years of helping. Years of fixing problems. Erased in a single moment, my father stepped forward and placed a blank agreement on the table in front of me. "Sign this," he said. I looked down. The paper confirmed acknowledgement of debt, written in formal language meant to lock responsibility in place. This wasn't just pressure. This was legal. They wanted documentation. Proof. Control. I need time, I said quietly. Just 4 words. But they shifted something in the room. My sister rolled her eyes. She won't last 2 days. She whispered loudly enough for me to hear as I turned away. I walked back to my room without another word. Closed the door. Locked it. Then I pulled my suitcase from the closet. The sound of its wheels scraping across the floor echoed louder than it should have. I opened it slowly and began packing. Not everything. Only what mattered. Documents first. Always first. The metal box sat on my bed. Heavy and steady. I opened it carefully, checking each envelope again before placing them inside my bag. Clothes followed. Then photographs. Small things. Meaningful things. Each item packed felt like a quiet declaration. Not defeat. Preparation. When everything was ready, I paused and looked around the room. The walls held years of memory. Birthdays. Holidays. Quiet mornings. But tonight, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a place I had outgrown, or maybe a place that had pushed me out long ago. I stepped into the hallway one last time. The house creaked softly beneath my feet. I ran my fingers along the wall as I passed, remembering laughter that once echoed here. For a moment, guilt flickered inside my chest. Then I remembered the spreadsheet, the accusations, the blank agreement, and the guilt faded. Outside, the night air felt cool against my skin, silent. Still, I carried the suitcase to my car and placed it carefully inside. No lights turned on. No doors opened. No one stopped me. I stood there for a moment, looking at the house. Then I got into the car, closed the door, started the engine. The sound broke the silence like a crack in glass. As I pulled away, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Unknown number. Ignored. Then again. Another call. And another. Finally, I glanced at the screen. A message from my sister. "Where are you?" Another appeared immediately. "Dad needs you." I stared at those words as the car rolled forward into the darkness. For the first time since that dinner, they weren't giving orders. They were asking. The sun was already rising by the time I pulled into the parking lot of the small apartment building, exhaustion settling deep into my bones. I sat there with the engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The building in front of me looked ordinary, faded brick, narrow windows. Nothing welcoming about it. But it was quiet. Quiet in a way my father's house had never been. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then I reached for my phone. 12 missed calls. 3 from my father. 5 from my sister. 4 from my mother. My chest tightened slightly. But not from fear. From confirmation. They had noticed my absence faster than I expected. I shut off the engine and stepped out into the cool morning air. The silence wrapped around me like something unfamiliar but strangely comforting. Inside the apartment, the emptiness greeted me immediately. Bare walls. Plain carpet. One window letting in a thin stripe of morning sunlight. No photographs. No noise. No voices waiting to accuse me. I placed my suitcase on the floor and closed the door behind me, locking it carefully. The click of the lock echoed louder than it should have. For the first time in years, no one else had a key to where I slept. That realization brought something unexpected. Relief. I walked slowly through the small space, touching the countertop, testing the faucet, opening cabinets that held nothing yet. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't comfortable. But it was mine. I began unpacking slowly, placing clothes into drawers and stacking papers neatly on the small kitchen counter. The metal box stayed within reach at all times, never out of sight. As I worked, my phone buzzed again. Another missed call. Unknown number this time. I ignored it. Moments later, the phone vibrated again. And again. Finally, I wiped my hands against my jeans and opened the message thread. The screen filled with texts stacked one after another. "Where did you go? You can't just disappear like this. Call me immediately." Each message carried a tone that shifted as I scrolled. At first, sharp, then impatient, then uncertain. And finally, the vendor called again. That message came from my sister. I stared at those words longer than the others. Vendor. That single word told me everything I needed to know. The problem had already started. Before I could finish reading, the phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Harold Jensen. My chest tightened slightly. Harold had worked at our furniture store for nearly 20 years. He was steady, reliable, the kind of man who rarely panicked. Which meant if he was calling me, something was wrong. I answered. "Hello, Linda," Harold said, his voice low but strained. "Are you still handling the accounts?" The question caught me off guard. "No," I said carefully. "I'm not." Silence followed. Longer than comfortable. "I thought so," he murmured. "What's happening?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "One of our vendors tried to process payment this morning," he explained. "It didn't go through." My stomach tightened. "They refused to release the shipment," he continued. "Said the account authorization wasn't valid." I lowered myself onto the kitchen chair, gripping the phone tighter. "Without my authorization." Transactions stalled. Everything began to freeze. "They asked if you were still working here," Harold added quietly. That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. "They were looking for me." "Not my father. Not my sister. Me." "I told them I didn't know," Harold said. "Thank you," I replied softly. We ended the call, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. I sat there for several minutes, staring at the blank wall ahead of me. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I hadn't shut down accounts. I hadn't touched their systems. I had simply left. And already, everything was beginning to shift. My phone buzzed again. 3 missed calls appeared instantly. Then 4. Then 5. They were stacking faster now. I rubbed my forehead slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. An hour passed before Harold called again. This time, his voice sounded tighter. "Linda, the accounting system locked us out," he said. My pulse quickened. "What do you mean locked out?" "Vendor flagged the account," he replied. "Said authorization credentials didn't match." I closed my eyes briefly. "Exactly what the lawyer warned." "They gave us a deadline," Harold continued. "If we don't resolve this soon, shipments will stop completely." Deadline. The word echoed in my mind. The same kind of pressure they tried to place on me, now turned against them. "Did something happen between you and your father?" Harold asked carefully. I didn't answer right away. How could I explain years of control, pressure, and quiet dependence in a single sentence? Something changed. I finally said, "That was enough." We ended the call again. Not long after, a voicemail notification appeared from my mother. I hesitated before pressing play. Her voice sounded different. Thinner, shaking slightly. "Linda, you need to call us," she said. A pause followed. Then softer. "We need to talk." Behind her voice, I heard shouting. My father's voice, loud, frustrated. My sister speaking quickly, almost panicked. The chaos spilled through the recording. I replayed it once more, listening closely. The anger I expected wasn't there. Fear had replaced it. Minutes later, an email notification appeared. Unknown sender. Subject line. Verification required. I opened it slowly. Formal language filled the screen. Operational authorization missing. Business activity temporarily restricted. Time-sensitive compliance required. I leaned back in the chair, letting the meaning settle. They couldn't move forward. Not without me. For a long time. I sat in silence. The apartment felt smaller than before, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily against my chest. I remembered my father teaching me how to balance books when I was younger, guiding my hand across paper, explaining numbers like they were puzzle pieces meant to fit together. He had trusted me once, relied on me, and somewhere along the way, that trust had twisted into expectation. Then entitlement. Then control. My phone buzzed again. More messages. Shorter now. Urgent. Dad's really worried now. That one came from my sister. No sarcasm. No mockery. Just fear. The sound of the phone ringing again cut through the silence. I looked down at the screen. Father. Calling again. The first direct call since I left. I stared at the screen, letting it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. My hand hovered near the phone but didn't move. For the first time in years. He wasn't calling to give orders. He was calling for help. And something deep inside me told me this was only the beginning of their collapse. My phone kept vibrating on the kitchen counter long after the sun disappeared outside the apartment window. I stood there watching it buzz across the surface like it had a life of its own. My father's name flashed across the screen again. The letters steady and insistent. For years, I answered every call he made. Every question. Every request. Every emergency. Tonight, I didn't move. The ringing stopped. For half a second, the room fell silent. Then the phone lit up again. This time, my mother's name. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying my breath. Still, I didn't answer. When the call ended, a voicemail notification appeared almost immediately. I hesitated before pressing play, my thumb hovering just above the screen. My father's voice came through the speaker. Call me when you get this. No yelling. No accusations. Just hesitation. I froze where I stood. There was something unfamiliar in his voice, something fragile. I had never heard uncertainty from him before. Even during the worst financial years, he had spoken with confidence, even when he didn't feel it. Behind his voice, I could hear noise in the background. Raised voices. Sharp. My sister. Arguing. The message ended abruptly. Silence filled the room again. Then another vibration. Messages stacked one after another. Where are you? Answer your phone. We need to talk. Each message came faster than the last, like panic spreading through their house room by room. My chest tightened as I watched them appear. The pattern was obvious. Father, urgent. Mother, pleading. Sister, frustrated. Panic had begun to replace control. Before I could think further, the phone rang again. Harold. I answered immediately. Linda, he said, his voice shaking slightly now. We have a bigger problem. My stomach tightened. What happened? I asked. One of our main suppliers canceled today's delivery, he explained. Said they won't release anything until the account authorization is corrected. I leaned against the counter slowly, gripping the edge to steady myself. Without my authorization, nothing moved. They specifically asked for you, Harold added quietly. That sentence landed heavily. Not my father. Not the store. Me? They said without your approval. They can't proceed. He continued. I closed my eyes briefly. The collapse wasn't theoretical anymore. It had started. Did you talk to my father? I asked. Yes, Harold replied after a pause. He sounded scared. That word echoed in my mind. Scared. My father had built his identity on confidence, on never letting anyone see weakness. Hearing that he sounded scared felt like witnessing something impossible. Before I could respond, another notification flashed across my phone. An email. Official. Formal. I opened it slowly. Verification required. Operational authorization missing. Temporary restrictions placed on business activity. The language was cold. Professional. Final. Legal. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just vendor pressure anymore. This was institutional. Systematic. Without correction. Everything would freeze. My phone buzzed again. A message from my sister. Please call me. I stared at it, surprised by the tone. No sarcasm. No mocking. Just urgency. Then another message appeared beneath it. Something's wrong. And then a third. Dad doesn't know what to do. That sentence shifted something deep inside me. For years, my father had been the one with answers. The one who made decisions. The one who controlled every situation. Now, According to her, he didn't know what to do. I lowered myself into the chair, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Just then, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a different name. Daniel Reeves. My lawyer. I answered quickly. Linda, he said calmly. I expected we might speak today. Something about his steady tone grounded me instantly. What's happening? I asked. We've received multiple verification requests tied to the business, he explained. Vendor complaints are escalating. My stomach tightened further. How serious is it? I asked. There was a brief pause. If unresolved, he said carefully, they could lose operational rights. Lose operational rights? Not just shipments. Not just vendors. Everything. The words settled heavily inside my chest. After we ended the call, I remained seated, staring at the silent phone. Memories began surfacing without warning. My father teaching me how to greet customers when I was younger. Standing beside me at the register, smiling proudly when I balanced accounts correctly. There had been trust once. Respect. Not this cold distance that now defined us. The phone buzzed again, pulling me back into the present. My sister. Calling. This time, I answered. Her voice exploded through the speaker immediately. Linda, you have to help us, she said. Breathless. No attitude. No arrogance. Only fear. What happened? I asked calmly. The payment system locked, she said quickly. We can't process anything. The bank flagged our account. I listened quietly. Suppliers are calling nonstop, she continued. They're demanding answers. Her voice cracked slightly. Dad's freaking out. That sentence confirmed everything. Panic had taken hold. There was a shuffling sound on her end, followed by muffled voices. Then my father's voice came through. Linda, he said. Not loud. Not commanding. Soft. Uncertain. We need to talk. Not, come home. Not, fix this. Just, we need to talk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched longer than comfortable. I'll think about it. I finally said, simple, measured, controlled. Not a promise. Not a refusal. Just time. We ended the call soon after. The apartment fell completely silent. No ringing. No voices. No shouting in the background. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. Days ago, they had given me a deadline, a demand, an ultimatum meant to force obedience. Now, everything had reversed. They were the ones running out of time. They were the ones waiting for answers. And for the first time in years, they weren't telling me what to do. They were asking me to decide. And deep inside, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tomorrow would not be about survival anymore. Tomorrow would be about power. My phone rang just after sunrise. The sound sharp against the quiet of my apartment. I already knew who it was before I picked it up. My father's name glowed on the screen. Steady but no longer threatening. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello. There was a pause on the other end, long enough for me to hear him inhale. Linda, he said, his voice lower than usual. Can we meet? Not come home. Not fix this. Meet. The difference settled deep inside my chest. Where? I asked. A cafe downtown, he replied. Somewhere neutral. Neutral. That word told me more than anything else he could have said. He didn't want the house. He didn't want control. He wanted ground that didn't belong to him. I'll be there, I said. When I arrived, the cafe was quiet. The kind of place where conversations stayed low and private. Sunlight filtered through the windows, warming the wooden tables. I chose a seat near the window and placed my legal folder beside me, resting my hand on top of it. My fingers felt steady, not shaking, not hesitant. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking into their space. They were walking into mine. A few minutes later, the door opened. All three of them entered together. My father, my mother, my sister. They moved slower than usual, their steps less confident, their faces tighter than I had ever seen before. My father looked older somehow, like the past few days had taken years from him. My mother avoided my eyes as they approached, and my sister kept her gaze locked on the floor. They sat across from me without ordering anything. No coffee, no small talk, just silence, heavy and thick. "You left us in a crisis," my father said finally. His voice carried strain, but not authority. "You knew this would happen," my mother added quietly. My sister leaned forward slightly. "You planned this," she said. I listened to them without interrupting, without reacting. Inside, something calm had taken root, something colder than anger. They believed this was revenge. They believed I had set a trap. They still didn't understand. I reached into the folder and slid a stack of papers across the table. The sound of paper against wood felt louder than it should have. "I didn't leave you helpless," I said calmly. They stared down at the documents, confusion flickering across their faces. "I left you with exactly what you gave me," I added. My father picked up the top page slowly. His eyes scanned the lines. His breathing changed. I watched his face carefully as recognition began to form. His brow tightened. His jaw stiffened. Then his voice lowered as he read aloud. "Authorized controlling representative?" The words faltered on his tongue. My mother leaned closer, peering at the page over his shoulder. My sister's posture stiffened beside them. "When did this happen?" my father asked. His voice no longer sounded angry. It sounded shaken. "Years ago," I answered. Silence fell across the table. Heavy. Unavoidable. "Your mother arranged it," I continued quietly. My father's eyes snapped toward me. "She didn't trust me," he whispered. That question cut deeper than I expected. My mother lowered her gaze, her shoulders slumping slightly. I reached into the folder again and pulled out another sheet. A photocopy of the handwritten letter. She believed the business needed protection. I said carefully, "She believed pressure would come eventually." My father stared at the page as if it might disappear. My mother didn't speak, didn't defend herself, just sat there, quiet and small. Then I placed another set of documents onto the table. Bank summaries, transaction logs, highlighted withdrawals, dates circled carefully. My sister noticed immediately. Her body went rigid. "What are those?" she asked. Her voice carried tension now. "Not confidence. Records," I replied calmly. "Would you like to explain these withdrawals?" The words hung in the air like a weight. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "I was fixing things," she said finally. The words came fast. Defensive. "Fixing what?" my father asked sharply. Her silence answered him before words ever could. I watched the realization spread across his face. Shock. Then anger. Then something worse. Defeat. My mother began crying softly, her shoulders trembling as she lowered her face into her hands. My father leaned back in his chair, staring down at the documents like they had rewritten his entire world. This explains the losses," he muttered. His hands trembled slightly as he turned another page. My sister stared straight ahead now, avoiding everyone's eyes. "This isn't revenge," I said quietly. "This is consequence." The word settled into the silence between us. No one argued. No one denied it. After several long moments, my father finally spoke again. "What happens now?" he asked. His voice sounded hollow. Not commanding. Not proud. Just tired. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. "I will help the business," I said. All three of them looked up at once. Hope flickered across their faces, fragile but visible. "But I will not return to live in that house," I continued. The hope shifted into something else. Acceptance. "This will be done differently," I added. "Every financial decision must be transparent. Every transaction must be approved properly." Silence followed. Not angry silence. Processing silence. My father nodded slowly. "Once. Then again." "We didn't realize," he began. His voice cracked slightly before he finished the sentence. My mother wiped her eyes. My sister stared at the table, her shoulders tight. Finally, my father looked back at me. "Will you help us?" he asked. Not demand, not order, a request. For the first time in my life, my father was asking instead of telling. I held his gaze for several long seconds, letting the moment settle fully between us. Because this was the moment everything changed. Not when I left the house, not when the calls began, but now, when the power to decide belonged to me, and tomorrow, I would choose what kind of future we would have. That night, after the cafe meeting, I returned to my apartment and sat alone at the kitchen table long after the sun had disappeared. The legal folder lay open in front of me, pages spread carefully across the surface. I stared at the documents without reading them, replaying every moment from earlier that day. My father's trembling hands, my mother's quiet tears, my sister's silence. For years, I had imagined confrontation would feel explosive, loud voices, slammed doors, accusations flying across the room. But what we had experienced wasn't loud. It was heavy, heavy with truth, heavy with consequences. And now, sitting in the quiet of my own apartment, the silence felt earned instead of suffocating. For the first time in days, my phone remained still. No calls, no messages, no panic, just stillness. I picked up the top document again and read through the highlighted sections slowly. Every clause made more sense now than it had the night before. My mother hadn't handed me power to control anyone. She handed me responsibility, protection, a shield, not a weapon. That realization shifted something deep inside me. Helping them didn't mean surrendering. Helping them meant choosing how the future would be built. The next morning, sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor in long, soft streaks. I held my phone in my hand for several minutes before finally dialing my father's number. He answered on the second ring. "Linda," he said quietly. No tension, no sharpness, just waiting. "I'm willing to help," I said. There was silence on the other end, not empty silence, but careful listening. "But things will change," I continued. "Everything must be documented properly. Every decision must be transparent." "I understand," he replied. The words sounded steady, but tired. Not defensive, not resistant, just accepting. We arranged to meet at Mr. Reeves's office that afternoon. The conference room felt colder than the cafe had, more official, more permanent. My father sat beside my mother, shoulders slightly hunched, while my sister kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mr. Reeves entered with several folders and placed them neatly on the table. "This restructuring will protect the business," he explained calmly, "but it will also prevent misuse." My father nodded slowly. "I agree," he said. My sister avoided eye contact. The truth unfolded fully. Transaction logs revealed mistakes that had been hidden under layers of rushed bookkeeping. Withdrawals made without proper approval. Not extravagant spending. Not luxury. Fear-driven decisions meant to cover earlier losses. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed, my sister admitted quietly. Her voice trembled slightly. I watched her carefully. For the first time, I didn't see arrogance. I saw panic, regret, fear of consequences that had finally caught up with her. "Mr. Reeves slid the final document forward. "Once signed," he said, "the business will continue under proper structure." My father picked up the pen slowly. Before signing, he paused and looked toward me. "I should have listened sooner," he said. His voice cracked slightly. Not dramatic, just honest. That moment stayed with me, because it wasn't apology alone that mattered. It was acknowledgement. When the meeting ended, we stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. My father lingered beside me while my mother and sister walked ahead. "I was wrong to push you out," he said quietly. I didn't answer right away. The words settled slowly inside my chest. Not healing everything, but opening space for something new. "Will you ever come back home?" he asked. I looked at him carefully before answering. "I'll help the business," I said. He nodded once. "But I won't live there again," I added. The words felt firm. Not angry. Not bitter. Final. He didn't argue. Didn't protest. Just lowered his head slightly and accepted it. That acceptance mattered more than any argument ever could. Later that evening, I returned to my apartment and unlocked the door slowly. The space looked different now. Not temporary. Not uncertain. Earned. I placed the metal box on a shelf near the wall, not hidden anymore. For years, it had been tucked away like something fragile. Now it stood openly, like a reminder of preparation and patience. The following morning, I visited the cemetery alone. The air felt still, quiet in a way that carried peace instead of tension. I stood in front of my mother's headstone, holding a small bundle of fresh flowers. For a long moment, I didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, letting the memories settle. "You trusted me," I whispered softly. The words barely left my lips, but they felt heavy with meaning. She had known this day might come. Known pressure would build. Known strength would be required. And she prepared me without ever raising her voice, without forcing confrontation. Just quiet planning. I placed the flowers carefully at the base of the stone and stepped back. A sense of calm settled over me. Not excitement. Not victory. But balance. Walking back to my car, sunlight warmed my face. And for the first time in years, my shoulders felt lighter. Not because problems disappeared, but because boundaries were finally in place. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a fresh cup of coffee, listening to the quiet hum of the apartment. My phone rested on the counter, still receiving occasional messages, but the tone had changed. Requests now, not demands. Respect now, not pressure. And in that quiet moment, I realized something important. The real revenge had never been about leaving. It had been about refusing to return as the same person. Some families don't recognize your value until the moment you stop carrying their weight. Until silence replaces sacrifice. Until consequences arrive without warning. If you've ever had to walk away from a situation just to protect your dignity, you understand how heavy that decision feels. And if you've ever been told you owed more than you gave, only to discover the truth later, then you know how powerful boundaries can be. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you loved? Did they respect your decision? Or did you have to stand firm until they finally understood? Share your story in the comments, because someone else listening might need the courage that your experience can give. And if stories like this remind you that strength doesn't always mean shouting, sometimes it means standing quietly and refusing to be used, stay here with us. Subscribe to this channel for more real-life family drama stories where truth, respect, and karma always find their way back. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't revenge at all. It's learning how to stand on your own and never letting anyone rewrite your worth again.